What would you think if I told you that most people spend their entire lives wearing masks so tightly pressed to their faces, they forget what their real skin feels like? They smile with borrowed expressions, desire with conditioned cravings, and regret with someone else's shame. And beneath all of this, buried under the polite performances and social rituals, is the raw, pulsating truth of who they really are. But few dare to look at it. Because to truly see yourself, as Carl Jung understood, is not a gentle act of enlightenment. It is a confrontation, a spiritual seduction, and sometimes a collapse. Jung called it the process of individuation, a reckoning between the self you pretend to be and the one who watches silently from within. The part of you that knows, the part of you that remembers, and the part of you that resents every lie you've ever told to avoid rejection or earn love. Most people think the journey to wholeness will feel like lightness or healing. But Jung knew better. He knew it begins in the dark. If a man spends his life chasing status or seduction, what he's really doing is running from his own reflection. The unconscious knows this game, and eventually it plays back. He will meet a woman, or perhaps a silence, that reflects back to him not his charm, but his emptiness. And that is when obsession begins. When a man projects his anima, the female half of his soul, onto a woman, it is not always because he loves her. It is often because she mirrors the part of him he refuses to integrate. She becomes his missing self, his forbidden door. And if he cannot open that door within, he will become addicted to the one who holds the key outside. But what about you? Do you know the difference between being desired and being devoured? Do you know how to sit in your own depths without shrinking from the gaze of your shadow? Most women, if they are honest, have at some point become the symbol of a man's projection. They have carried his longing, his wounds, and his unfinished business in silence, believing it was romance, when in fact, it was displacement. And in that moment, the woman becomes more than a woman. She becomes an archetype, sometimes the nurturer, sometimes the seductress, sometimes the ghost he can never quite hold on to. Jung's method of seeing the true self is not about affirmations or surface confidence. It is about what happens when you stop blaming others for your triggers and start asking, why am I so deeply affected? What am I protecting? What am I terrified to see? The ego protects you from this inquiry because it wants comfort, not truth. But the soul? The soul is starving for the truth, no matter how sharp it tastes. There is a moment in every woman's life when she realizes she is not just playing roles anymore, she is waking up from them. And this awakening is not always beautiful. Sometimes it feels like isolation. Sometimes it feels like losing the very things you thought would make you whole. But it is in this collapse of false identity that the real self starts to whisper. And when you listen closely enough, you hear it say, "You were never meant to be just someone's mirror. You were meant to be your own reflection." Carl Jung's teachings reveal that what you crave is often the very thing you fear to become. The man craves emotional depth, but fears his own vulnerability. The woman craves to be seen beyond her body, but fears the solitude of detachment. And in this silent tug-of-war, both lose. Unless they stop, stare into the abyss of their own patterns, and ask the question that burns beneath every psychological wound. Who am I when no one is watching? You see, the true self is not something you find. It is something you return to after shedding every layer that was designed to make you more palatable to a world addicted to comfort. It requires spiritual violence, not against others, but against your own illusion. To strip away the ego's performance, to reject the seduction of constant validation, to sit still and unadorned in the nakedness of your being. And when you do this, when you finally see your true self, you will understand why most people avoid this work. because it changes everything. It is not about becoming better. It is about becoming real. And realness, in a world built on masks, is the ultimate rebellion. Jung understood something that most modern minds refuse to entertain. The true self is not always noble, and it is never convenient. It is raw. It is primal. It contains light, yes, but also the chaos of your hidden cravings, the humiliating ache of envy, the cold edges of power you pretend not to want. This is why seeing your true self requires more than therapy, more than meditation, more than positive thinking. It requires shadow work. It requires standing at the crossroads of desire and destruction, knowing full well that parts of you enjoy both. Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror that reflects not just your image, but your entire unconscious life. Every suppressed need, every forbidden thought, every time you lied to avoid being abandoned. That is what the process of individuation really is. A confrontation with the unlived life. The life you locked away because society told you to be polite, or beautiful, or humble, or small. Jung called this the shadow, the part of you that holds the things you reject in order to appear acceptable. But here is the paradox. The more you reject your shadow, the more it owns you. The more you pretend to be light, the more darkness controls your decisions from the background. The woman who denies her rage becomes passive-aggressive. The man who denies his vulnerability becomes controlling. The lover who denies their longing becomes cold and detached, confusing emotional starvation with spiritual detachment. And so you ask, how do I see my true self, Carl Jung? The answer is not comfortable, but it is clear. You must first see who you pretend to be. You must catch yourself in the act of performance. You must notice the moment you flirt to avoid loneliness, the moment you shrink to make someone else feel powerful, the moment you silence your intuition because you're afraid of being called difficult. Every time you betray yourself to be loved, you add another layer to the mask. And every mask takes you further away from the truth. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he never said it would feel good. In fact, it often feels like loss. You lose the version of yourself that was designed to survive social approval. You lose the relationships that were built on your inauthenticity. You lose the addiction to being liked. And in return, you gain something terrifying, but holy: freedom. If you are a woman watching this, ask yourself, have I ever let someone fall in love with the mask while hiding the core? Have I ever played the cool girl, the healer, the muse, knowing it was safer than revealing the full complexity of my being? Most women have. Because for centuries, femininity has been sold as accommodation. Be soft, be desirable, be needed. But Jung's depth psychology invites you to something more dangerous: to be real. And if you are a man watching this, know this. Obsession begins when you meet a woman who triggers the part of your unconscious you've never faced. She awakens not just desire, but discomfort. She reminds you of the emotions you've suppressed to maintain control. And when you cannot own these parts of yourself, you will try to possess her instead. But possession is not love. It is shadow projection. It is the ego's attempt to control what the soul knows must be surrendered to. This is why relationships become battlegrounds of unconscious material. We don't see each other. We see our wounds, our fantasies, our unresolved parental imprints. We chase lovers not because they are right for us, but because they mirror back to us the parts we have not integrated. And so we become addicted, not to the person, but to the pattern. Jung teaches that real love begins after the projections collapse, after you stop chasing your mother or father in romantic form, after you stop expecting another person to save you from your own emotional labor, and after you take back your shadow, piece by piece, until you can stand in front of your reflection without shame. This is why the question, How do I see my true self? Is not a soft spiritual inquiry, it is a dangerous initiation. It is the choice to dissolve every false identity you've built to survive. And in that dissolution, you will find both terror and liberation. The true self is not given. It is carved out of the ruins of who you thought you had to be. Most people are not ready for this kind of work. They want enlightenment without sacrifice. They want love without vulnerability. They want power without the humility of knowing their own darkness. But Jung warned that the path to the true self is not paved in comfort. It is carved through the labyrinth of your forbidden desires. Desire is not the enemy. It is the compass. But if you do not understand your desires, they will control you from the shadows. Jung wrote extensively about the complex, emotional knots of unresolved need, rejection, trauma, and longing that hijack your behavior when you least expect it. The moment you find yourself obsessed, addicted, or spiraling in regret, you are inside a complex. This is why so many relationships feel like cycles instead of growth. You keep attracting the same person in different bodies because the unconscious is trying to heal through repetition. It keeps placing the same emotional lesson in front of you until you finally see the pattern, not the person. For a woman, this might look like repeatedly choosing men who cannot commit. Not because she is weak, but because a part of her is addicted to the ache of absence. She confuses longing with love because it mirrors an old story. The father who wasn't emotionally available, the mother who taught her that self-sacrifice is virtue. Her shadow desires the wound because the wound is familiar. For a man, it might look like idealizing a woman beyond human proportions. He places her on a pedestal because he is terrified of meeting her as an equal. She becomes an archetype, the anima, not a person. But no woman can live up to this. And when she eventually disappoints, he feels betrayed. Not because she did something wrong, but because his fantasy collapsed. Jung called this withdrawal of projections, and it is the beginning of maturity. When you stop projecting perfection onto others, you meet them as they are. And this requires you to meet yourself as you are, the sacred and the flawed, the divine and the damaged. So how do you see your true self? You stop running from the mirror. You stop blaming other people for the emotional reactions they trigger in you. You stop avoiding solitude, because in solitude, the shadow finally speaks. It tells you what you really want, what you really fear, what you've been too proud to admit. If you listen carefully, you'll hear the same message Jung heard in his own descent into the unconscious. The self is not something you create. It is something you uncover. But there is a cost. When you become conscious of your true self, you can no longer play small. You can no longer live according to someone else's expectations. You can no longer betray your own intuition just to belong. And this frightens people more than death itself. The death of the mask. The death of the false life they spent years constructing. This is why spiritual growth often feels like grief. You grieve the woman who lived for external approval. You grieve the man who defined his worth by conquest. You grieve the identity that kept you safe, but suffocated your soul. And yet, beyond the grief is something untouchable, a center of gravity inside you that cannot be shaken by rejection, obsession, or regret. Jung called this the self, the archetype of wholeness. It contains both your light and your darkness, your joy and your sorrow, your power and your surrender. It is the part of you that does not need to prove anything, because it already knows its worth. When you meet this part of yourself, desire becomes sacred. You no longer chase people to complete you. You no longer fear solitude because you are finally home in your own consciousness. You see relationships not as escapes from loneliness, but as mirrors for expansion. And here is the secret Jung never explicitly wrote but always hinted at. The deeper you go into yourself, the more you stop craving possession and start practicing presence. You stop trying to own love, and instead, you become it, quietly, without demand. Most women spend their lives asking, "Why do I attract unavailable men?" But the better question is, what part of me is unavailable to myself? Most men ask, "Why do I desire women I cannot have?" But the deeper question is, what part of me am I projecting onto her because I have not dared to own it? When you see the truth beneath these patterns, obsession fades. Not because the longing disappears, but because you finally understand its source. And from this understanding, a new life begins, not built on addiction, but on awareness. There is a silent moment in every person's life when the question shifts from who do I want to be loved by to who am I when no one is watching. This is the beginning of individuation, the sacred journey Jung believed every soul must take if it wishes to awaken from unconscious living. But the path is dangerous, not because the world will hurt you, but because you will meet parts of yourself you have long abandoned. Jung's most important book, The Red Book, was not merely a collection of mystical visions. It was a confrontation with the forbidden contents of his own psyche. It was the unraveling of his ego and the birth of something deeper, the awareness that his conscious self was only a fraction of his being. Most people never make it this far. They stop at personal development, confusing surface-level positivity with true transformation. They memorize affirmations, but never examine the wounds that control their attachments. They try to manifest love without asking why they fear intimacy. They seek success while secretly sabotaging it, because success threatens to expose their unworthiness. This is why the Red Book remains so haunting. It whispers truths the ego does not want to hear. That desire is not just for pleasure, it is for pain. That we long for the very things that will break us open, precisely because we are terrified of waking up. Some women carry this in the shape of relationships that drain them. They choose men who mirror their own self-abandonment. They call it love, but it is really survival. It is easier to fix a broken man than to face the loneliness of being whole. Because wholeness means no longer making excuses for your own shrinking. It means no longer tolerating breadcrumbs of affection when you deserve a feast. Some men live this pattern by obsessing over women they cannot possess. They chase the distant woman, the unavailable lover, the ghost of intimacy just out of reach. Why? Because conquest feels safer than connection. If he wins her, the chase ends, and with it, his reason to avoid vulnerability. But what if you saw through this? What if you recognized that these patterns are not random? They are maps of your shadow. Jung taught that the shadow contains everything the ego rejects: anger, lust, envy, shame, but also power, creativity, and love untamed by social norms. The shadow is not evil, it is energy. When repressed, it turns against you. When integrated, it becomes the source of your magnetism. This is why some women seem to radiate a dangerous, irresistible allure. They are not playing games. They have simply stopped apologizing for their depth. They have made peace with their dark femininity, the part that does not beg for love but chooses it, the part that can walk away without regret because she knows her desire is sacred, not transactional. And some men, once they integrate their shadow, stop chasing fantasies and begin loving women for who they are, not for the projections they place upon them. These men are rare because it is easier to stay asleep in the cycle of addiction than to wake up to the mirror of your own soul. The Red Book teaches this paradox. The more conscious you become, the more you must surrender control. You stop trying to dominate life and begin allowing life to move through you. Desire becomes a compass, not a cage. Regret becomes a teacher, not a prison. There are 3 hidden obsessions in every human psyche, and Jung's writings pointed to them, though he never named them outright. The obsession with being seen, the obsession with being needed, and the obsession with escaping the responsibility of true freedom. To see your true self is to burn these obsessions in the fire of awareness. It is to realize that being seen is not enough. You must see yourself. Being needed is not enough. You must need yourself. And freedom is not escape. It is radical self-ownership. Imagine living this way. Imagine waking up one morning and no longer craving validation from anyone. Imagine looking at your past with compassion instead of regret. Imagine loving without clinging, desiring without losing your center, and walking away from anything that dims your light. This is not a fantasy. It is the reality waiting for you beneath the surface of your current life. But you cannot access it by pretending to be perfect. You access it by embracing your wholeness, the beauty and the brutality, the love and the longing, the shadow and the self. Jung's deepest message was not about theory. It was about transformation. And the question is not, are you ready? The question is, will you choose it, even when it terrifies you? There is a doorway most people never enter, not because it is locked, but because it requires the ultimate sacrifice, the death of who you thought you were. When Carl Jung wrote about the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the self with a capital S, he described something terrifying and holy. The self is not your goals. It is not your reputation. It is not your image in the eyes of others. The self is the unfiltered totality of your being, both light and shadow, both love and destruction, both creator and destroyer. This is why most people live fragmented. They try to polish the surface while hiding the depths. They curate the version of themselves that pleases the world, while burying the parts that threaten comfort. But buried energy does not disappear. It waits. It grows stronger in silence, feeding the obsessions no one dares confess. Do you know how many women stay in relationships that keep them small, simply because being fully seen feels more dangerous than being unloved? Do you know how many men secretly fantasize about freedom but chain themselves to roles that deplete their souls, because admitting they're lost would shatter the mask of competence? Carl Jung's most important writings reveal this painful truth. Every human carries a forbidden desire for annihilation and rebirth. It is the desire to burn down the false self, to collapse into chaos, and to rise again without the lies. But instead of allowing this sacred death, people cling to patterns that feel familiar. The toxic relationship becomes a ritual. The obsession with control becomes an addiction. The fear of solitude keeps them chasing what drains them. They would rather bleed slowly in the known than risk the shock of the unknown. This is the origin of obsession. It is not about the other person. It is about the unconscious parts of you screaming for integration. Some women become addicted to fixing broken men because it allows them to avoid fixing the abandonment in their own hearts. Some men become obsessed with unattainable women because it keeps them from facing the vulnerability of real intimacy. And both are trapped, not by love, but by projection. Jung called this the anima and animus dance, the projection of the ideal feminine onto a woman, the projection of the ideal masculine onto a man. But what happens when the projection collapses? What happens when you realize the person you loved was not who you thought they were, but a mirror of your own longing? This is when the true work begins. When the veil is lifted, you face the naked self. In this moment, the ego has two choices: retreat into bitterness or surrender to growth. Bitter people stay obsessed with the past. They replay the rejection, the betrayal, the loss. They mistake pain for identity. But those on the path of individuation transmute this pain into power. They stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What in me chose this pattern?" They stop trying to change other people and begin transforming themselves. This is where shadow work becomes essential. Shadow work is not about fixing flaws. It is about illuminating the dark desires that silently control you. It is about admitting the parts of yourself you've denied. Do you long to be worshipped, but pretend to be humble? Do you fear abandonment so much that you manipulate closeness? Do you reject feminine softness because you secretly believe it makes you weak? These are not sins. They are survival strategies. But they stop serving you when you refuse to examine them. Jung's Red Book was not a guide for the masses. It was a map of the descent into the unconscious. It was a blueprint for those willing to face the darkness within. When you begin this work, the world changes. You stop seeing relationships as transactions and start viewing them as mirrors. Every obsession becomes a lesson. Every heartbreak becomes a portal. You realize that desire is not meant to be obeyed blindly. It is meant to be questioned, decoded, and purified. And then something extraordinary happens. You detach from needing the other person to complete you. You still feel love, but it is no longer laced with desperation. You still desire connection, but not at the cost of your own soul. This is what it means to see your true self, not as a concept, but as a living reality. It is raw, it is sacred, and it requires more courage than most people are willing to summon. But for those who do, life becomes something different. It becomes a canvas, not a cage. You no longer live for approval. You live in alignment with the deepest parts of your being. And when you meet someone who matches that frequency, it is no longer obsession. It is resonance. And still, the deeper you go, the more unnerving the silence becomes. The silence of the soul, once you strip away the roles, the labels, the validation. It is not quiet because it lacks sound. It is quiet because it no longer begs for noise. It is the silence of one who has met her own abyss and stayed. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he left out the part that most never claim this privilege. They are too distracted, too afraid, or too dependent on being who others expect them to be. What you must understand is this. When you truly see yourself, you begin to see others as they really are, not as you hoped they would be. This is where obsession loses its grip, because obsession only survives in the fantasy. When you become intimate with your unconscious, your projections begin to dissolve. You stop chasing archetypes that mirror your wounds. You stop needing someone else to embody your worth, your sensuality, your mystery. You embody it yourself. But this comes at a price. You will mourn who you used to be. You will grieve the versions of you that clung to broken things. You will feel, for a time, like there is no one left to impress, no one left to save, no one left to blame. And in that void, something extraordinary will emerge. A sovereignty so powerful that it cannot be taken from you, even if you lose everything. Most people believe their desires are personal, that their longing is unique. But Jung taught that the unconscious is collective, that your deepest cravings are not just yours. They are archetypal. The desire to be seen, held, chosen, worshipped. These are not flaws. These are the feminine echoes of a larger cosmic dance. But when you attach them to one man, one fantasy, one illusion, you suffer. Because the masculine you crave is not fully embodied in most men, it must first be found within you. You must father yourself, discipline your impulses, guide your emotions, protect your softness. When the inner masculine becomes strong enough, the outer masculine can no longer manipulate you. And the same is true for men. When a man projects his animus onto a woman, he desires her not as she is, but as the carrier of his lost soul. This is why some women feel worshipped and abandoned in the same breath, because he is not seeing her. He is seeing the part of himself he cannot reach without her. But once he integrates his own unconscious feminine, his intuition, his softness, his receptivity, he no longer needs to possess a woman to feel whole. He chooses her, not to complete him, but to accompany him. And that is the difference between a prison and a partnership. Jung's psychology isn't about answers. It's about turning the gaze inward so relentlessly that the lies fall away. What remains? Your rage, your longing, your creativity, your hunger for love that is not afraid of your darkness. This is why some people feel like home, even when they trigger you, because your soul recognizes them, not as saviors, but as guides. They stir your depths. They call forward your shadows. They make you confront the parts of you you've kept hidden for too long. These relationships don't always last, but they always mark you. They burn through illusions. They break open false identities. They awaken something ancient and sacred in your blood. You may never forget them, not because of what they gave you, but because of what they revealed. And what they revealed was always yours to begin with. So how do you see your true self? You stop running from what hurts. You stop performing for love. You stop pretending you're fine with crumbs when you were made for feasts. You reclaim the broken, wild, sensual, angry, gentle, divine parts of you. You let the ego crack. You let the mask fall. You let the truth echo louder than your fear. This is not a path for the faint-hearted, but it is the only path that leads to freedom. And somewhere along the way, when you no longer need anyone to save you, someone appears, not to rescue, but to meet you. Not to complete your story, but to walk beside you as you write the next chapter in your own hand. The woman who sees her true self doesn't chase love. She becomes it. Most women do not realize how much of their desire is entangled with survival. From the moment you are born, you are conditioned to believe that being wanted is the same as being safe. That if you are desirable, you are worthy. That if you are chosen, you are protected. And so you mold yourself, sometimes in small, subtle ways, sometimes in ways that tear you apart, to fit the expectations of love. Carl Jung warned of this trap. He spoke of the false self, the persona that we present to the world, the version of you that smiles when you want to scream, the version that stays quiet so you won't be abandoned, the version that seduces when what you actually crave is deep, reverent connection. But the true self, the one hidden beneath the roles and performances, does not care to be liked. It only cares to be known. The journey of seeing your true self is not about becoming better at love or more strategic in attraction. It is about peeling back the layers of performance until what remains is so real, so raw, that it terrifies anyone still addicted to illusion. That is where the danger lies. When a woman steps into her full feminine power, not the watered-down version that panders to fragile egos, but the elemental, unapologetic force of her own depth, she becomes a mirror, and most men are not ready for what that mirror reflects. Some will project their shadows onto you. They will call you too much, too complicated, too emotional. Not because you are, but because you awaken parts of them they have spent a lifetime suppressing. Some will try to possess you, to cage you, to dilute you. They will worship you one moment and punish you the next, not out of cruelty, but because they are caught between reverence and terror, between desire and the fear of annihilation. This is the obsession that men cannot speak out loud, the obsession with the woman who sees too much, the woman who cannot be controlled because she no longer betrays herself for approval. In Jung's most important work, he wrote of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, of facing the unconscious. And for both men and women, this means confronting the forbidden desires they dare not admit. The desire to dominate and to surrender. The desire to be held and to disappear. The desire to be loved without condition, yet to remain unattached to outcome. These desires are not wrong. They are not sinful. They are part of the human condition. But when they are repressed, they become obsessions. They twist into patterns of control, manipulation, and longing for what cannot be owned. True spiritual femininity does not demand to be desired. It embodies desire itself. When you awaken this energy, You no longer chase love. You become the embodiment of it. You no longer tolerate half-hearted attention or shallow validation. You no longer mistake chemistry for compatibility or intensity for intimacy. You understand the difference between projection and presence, between being wanted and being seen, between being worshipped and being known. And this is where most relationships crumble, not because love fails, but because illusion does. When a man looks at a woman who has seen her true self, he is forced to see his own. No masks, no games, just raw, sacred confrontation. Will he meet you there? Sometimes. Will he run from you? Often. But neither outcome defines your worth. Because once you see your true self, you cannot unsee it. You will not return to the cage. You will not shrink to fit inside someone else's fantasy. You will not betray the woman you have become just to soothe someone else's fear of depth. You will walk forward alone if you must, knowing that the real love, the kind that does not burn you but refines you, is never found in chasing or clinging. It is found in meeting someone eye to eye, soul to soul, without losing yourself in the process. And in the end, Carl Jung's true message is not about desire or even psychology. It is about liberation. The liberation that comes when you stop seeking permission to be who you already are. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.